On today's program, a special episode on civics and the renewed importance of civic education as viewed through the lens of national security. This program, a collaboration between Talking Beats and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, features 3 distinguished guests, 1 returning and 2 newcomers to this show. I'm pleased to introduce them. Elizabeth Rindskopf Parker has a wealth of experience in both the law and national security, having served as general counsel for both the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. She serves as a member of the advisory board of the Rise Center on Law and Security at the New York University School of Law. Elizabeth Rindskopf Parker, welcome. Ted McConnell has been involved in political and governmental sectors for more than 40 years, holding positions such as Congressional Affairs Assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce and 1980 Presidential Transition Assistant. He's currently Director of Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, a coalition of over 70 national civic learning, education, civic engagement, and business groups working to improve civic education in America's schools. Ted McConnell, welcome. And returning to this show, Suzanne Spaulding, Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, she served as Undersecretary for the Department of Homeland Security, where she led the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Ms. Spaulding has served in both Republican and Democratic administrations on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Welcome back to you. It's thrilling to have you all here. I was thinking how to approach talking to the 3 of you because you have diverse backgrounds, you have diverse careers, but you have a common goal. Elizabeth, you told me I could call you Elizabeth before we started. Could
Absolutely.
you tell me what is the common goal the 3 of you have? And I called you the Civic Musketeers. It's a name I came up with. You seem to like it. What is this all about? What are you doing here?
Well, I think that Suzanne and I, who come at the problem initially from a national security perspective, have come to the conclusion that we have weakened our resilience as a nation by an inattention to civic education over many decades. And while I wouldn't have asked you to go through every step of my lengthy resume, at a 10-year stretch as dean of a law school, I became acutely aware of this problem. And I sometimes offer a little vignette in my national security world. After leaving government, I had an opportunity to get to know, in a multidisciplinary exchange, 2 Russians, and they once said, "We know what your weakness is, it's your diversity." At the time, I thought they were wrong. Now I know that that is indeed their view and the view of others too. And there's an effort to undermine what knits us together as an effective functioning democracy. And I think that's really where we see civic education as a national security imperative. And I say we here, I think Ted agrees, but this was really the entrance point, I think, for Suzanne and me.
Suzanne, can you pick up on that? Talk about the realization that you had when you thought to yourself, this is somehow related to national security, this lack, which we'll get into, of civic education goes beyond just a pure shame that it's not more commonly addressed in our schools.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. And it's such a pleasure to be back with you on your podcast. Thanks for having me back. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be here with my longtime mentor and dear friend, Elizabeth Rindskopf Parker, and my new mentor and best friend, Ted McConnell. But yes, I came to this way too late in my career, I'm embarrassed to say, really after I left DHS, where we had spent a lot of time working on protecting our election infrastructure in 2016, and only belatedly, I'm sorry to say, realized the scale and scope of the information operation that had been launched by Russia to interfere in our election. And the intelligence community pointed out that what we saw in the 2016 election was really just part of a longer-term, ongoing campaign by Russia to undermine our democracy. through information operations and to undermine public faith and confidence in our democratic institutions beyond elections. Certainly a big push around our elections and trying to get people to lose faith in the legitimacy of our elections, but also to lose faith in the legitimacy of other institutions. And I spent a lot of time then looking at thinking about where, if I were Putin, where would I go next if I wanted to really undermine democratic institutions? And I thought, what other institution, like elections, is as dependent on the public's faith and confidence in the legitimacy of the process to respect the legitimacy of the outcome? And I'm trained as a lawyer, and I immediately thought about our courts and our justice system, where public trust and confidence is so important. And over the last few years, we have uncovered lots of evidence of the ways in which Russia works to undermine public trust in our courts and our justice system as well. And so as we thought about how do we counter this, so we talk about the work the platforms have to do and media literacy, which is really important. But ultimately, we need to build public resilience against the pernicious messaging, right? What Putin is trying to do, and other adversaries are taking note, is to rob our democracy of the informed and engaged citizenry that we need to survive as a healthy democracy. We need our citizens to be informed, and we need them to be engaged. And Putin is attacking both of those, trying to convince Americans that they can't know the truth. There is no truth, right? Wants to move us to this post-truth world by throwing a bunch of disinformation up there and confusing people. And then the narrative that gets pushed, and we're seeing it around the election, and we see it in the narratives around the justice system, is that the system is irrevocably broken, that it is irrevocably rigged, and can't be trusted. And that is, I think, designed to get Americans to shrug their shoulders and disengage. It's to depress voter turnout. It is to undermine public trust in our justice system and in our other institutions. And so that made us realize that we need to fight that message, right? We need to build public resilience, remind Americans what democracy is all about, how they are responsible for holding our institutions accountable. Our institutions aren't perfect, but are susceptible to change. And that's the beautiful thing about democracy as opposed to authoritarian regimes, that our democracy is under attack, and that every American has to take a role. It's part of our civic responsibility, right, to be engaged and informed. And so that's civics education. And that when I raised it with Elizabeth, she said, of course, because she'd been thinking about these issues much longer than I had, and brought in Ted McConnell, and the rest is, we hope, someday history.
Ted McConnell, talk about the trends of civic education in the United States and public schools. Address shortcomings you see, address ways in which we have done well. We are 330 million Americans. Have we done well at all? It seems like this is an uphill battle, but I could be wrong.
Daniel, first, it is a joy to be on your podcast. Thank you for the invitation, and an equal joy to be here with these two longtime guardians of our democracy, Elizabeth and Suzanne. First, let's start with a definition so we're all on the same page, just what the heck this thing is, civic education, that we're all talking about. Depending on when you went to school, you might have a different take on this, if you got any at all. Civic education can be broadly defined as the provision of information and learning experiences to equip and empower all citizens, particularly our young citizens, to effectively and knowledgeably participate in the small d democratic processes. This education can take many forms, including classroom-based learning, experiential learning, service learning, simulations of small d democratic processes, and discussion of current and controversial issues in the classroom. Civic education most often occurs K-12 in K-12 schools and higher education, but parents, the family, religious and community institutions play an important role in civic learning. You know, the founders of our nation, shortly after they established it, realized they'd created something revolutionary, unprecedented in the world history of how we govern ourselves. So early on in the history of our country, many of the founders and the next generation after them advocated, we have to educate the citizenry how to best handle the rights and responsibilities we gave them. We promised them in the Declaration of Independence, and we gave unto them in the Constitution. So a major reason for the establishment of a free system of public education in this country was to provide that knowledge and the skills to be an effective citizen. And yes, not everybody originally got that. It's taken an evolutionary process, a large part of which was made possible by our Constitution and people who understood the Constitution and how the Constitution could help in expanding the franchise and expanding opportunities. Frankly, civic education has been in decline in both quantity and qualities in schools across this country. And you can date that decline to a certain October night in 1957, when the then Soviet Union launched a little basketball thing into space called Sputnik. And we began one of our periodic national panics. Oh my goodness, we're falling behind the rest of the world in math and STEM. We still cling to an agrarian school calendar in this country. So there are only so many days and so many hours in a school day. And these periodic education reforms that have stressed STEM and English, no matter how well-intentioned they are, and no matter how important they are, have had the byproduct of squeezing the time and attention for civic learning in our schools today. And I'm sure we'll come back a little bit more to some specifics on this.
One thing we talk about on this podcast a lot is where have the humanities gone? When I asked Walter Isaacson, who likes to blend humanities and sciences together, I said, do we need big, loud, outright defenders of the humanities sort of banging the pots and pans on the street? And this is about a year ago. He said, no, they defend themselves. I think things are very different now. We were talking about Beethoven before, a figure I never thought would be attacked. So it's very fluid, but STEM has had a very damaging effect on the teaching of the humanities, which is to our detriment, I believe. Elizabeth, talk about what you were thinking when you were in decades of law in the government. Were you looking around ever wondering, I wonder what curriculum is being taught in, say, some school down the street from your office, and wonder how that's going to affect the graduates 10 years after they graduate? Are they thinking about something that could have to do with security in a tangential way? Are they thinking about something that could be related to duty or responsibility as a citizen?
Well, Daniel, I think I had a fairly privileged background and also life experience. And although I began doing civil rights in the Deep South as a litigator, by the time I arrived for 12 years in national security topics, I was then a mother. My daughter was going to a fine school in Washington, D.C. And I remember one of her best teachers was a Yale law student. They had a very rich experience with what I would call an engaged civic experience. And I think for me, I assumed that everything was as I had experienced it until I became, as I mentioned, a law school dean. This is now 2000, really, about that time. And suddenly I began to look around, and a number of anecdotal experiences suggested to me that there might be a problem. Perhaps for me, a real wake-up call was talking with a funder. I was hoping to build on an experience where I'd created a law-themed high school for underprivileged, really, students who were greatly diverse in their backgrounds and financial capability and so on. And I thought this had been very successful. And I said, well, how about if we were to scale this up? And this funding source said to me, well, she said, there's no gold standard curriculum for the civic education you're trying to deliver. But she said, and this was what caught my attention, if there were, we don't have the teacher corps to deliver it. And I was shocked at what that might mean. And gradually I came to understand, Ted really opened my eyes, that we've paid so little attention to civics for so many years that with the exception of the very top, best supported schools, and that would be oftentimes a private school setting, we do not fund the teachers, we don't train and support them, and they in turn do not learn the kind of civic background and understanding they need to deliver the kind of course content we want. About the same time, there was a very interesting study that our then Chief Justice of California Supreme Court launched to look at how we were doing in our understanding of the court system. And here again, anecdotally, he said, we're calling this a commission for an impartial judiciary because we found surveys tell us that no one knows what an independent judiciary is. So little tiny seeds of thought, and gradually I began to knit these together, and I began to see that things were not as I had assumed them to be. And indeed, we did have a really serious problem confronting us, not just in California, but across the nation. And of course, Ted has now, what shall we say, informed my instincts and anecdotes with incredible amounts of surveys that again and again prove that my instincts, based on small experiences like this, were turned out to be very correct. Ted could fill, I think, our podcast with stunning statistics, but I think perhaps the most troubling are what little confidence, support, and commitment we find students have to democracy as a form of government. They don't understand it, they don't know about it, they don't care about it. And that, of course, feeds right into the threat that Suzanne so beautifully articulated. And so I would say, Daniel, that I just think it's terrific that we've got this podcast that you're supporting, because there's too little conversation and understanding of this. So thank you for having us.
And Daniel, I want to pick up, you made a really important point in addition to the terrific answer that Elizabeth gave about the importance of civic education for those who may be considering entering the national security field, right? And that is certainly something that we have thought about. I don't know that we've thought of it in the context of civic education, but certainly in the context of ethics education. And I think they go hand in hand. We have had a number of programs. Elizabeth and I have both been involved with the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security. We have big conferences for young national security lawyers and students thinking about it. And one of the things we always talk about is, who is your client as a national security lawyer? And the answer, of course, is not the Secretary of Defense or the head of your individual office. It is the American people and the Constitution. And that's an important aspect of that civic education, is the responsibility of individuals and their role in sustaining our democracy, whether in a national security field or any other.
It's a very interesting thing you bring up. I want to go to Ted in a minute to ask a few mechanical questions, but Suzanne, while you're here, the three of you have spoken eloquently on the role of foreign actors, for example, Russia, in undermining faith in our democracy. This is something that Suzanne, you and I talked about a lot, the first appearance you made on this show. What do you think the role of responsibility news organizations have is in all of this? Is there some responsibility that has to be put on the shoulders of big news organizations?
Absolutely. All of us have a responsibility, and our mainstream media and our social media platforms, which are increasingly the go-to source for news for so many Americans, have to step up to this responsibility. And I think they're beginning to get it. I really do. My sense is, watching the way most of the media is approaching, for example, this run-up to the election, I think they are really trying to be responsible. There's an interesting thing happening right now around a New York Post story that just came out
I want
where
to talk about, just you take a minute to address that and fill us in. It's playing out right now as we're speaking.
Yeah, well, so the New York Post came out with an article that was, raising allegations around Vice President Biden, and based on a story about, having gotten these emails in some legitimate way off of Biden's son, Hunter Biden's laptop through a computer repair shop. And it's very interesting. Of course, the New York Post came out with the story, and normally what happens, and this is what Russia and other bad actors take advantage of when they want to place disinformation, and we don't know yet they're still checking out this story. But normally what happens is they'll put it in some outlet. New York Post is pretty, well known, but they can put it in more fringe outlets, but then it gets picked up, right, on social media. It gets retweeted on Twitter, and a lot of reporters these days pull a lot of their stories off of Twitter. So then it gets itself into the mainstream of media, and as a story. And then much later, perhaps people go back and say, oh, you know what? Actually, I don't think that was particularly accurate, or there were these problems with it. And what's been interesting about this one is a lot of the lessons we are learning don't repeat the disinformation. If you think it's disinformation, and I'm trying to be careful in talking about this article, not to repeat the disinformation as you're trying to, withhold judgment about whether it's accurate or not. A lot of the researchers, so non-governmental parties who are on this right away and looking at the metadata and looking at, how this material is presented and whether it could be in fact what it says. So a lot of skepticism. And I think that's really an important part of this story. The platforms have also taken steps to reduce the virality of this story. They haven't removed it, but they have taken steps while they are checking the veracity of the details of the story to keep it from, this is the Mark Twain quip attributed at least to Mark Twain, right? That lies make their way around the world before the truth can get their pants on. So I think the platforms are trying to sort of give truth a chance to get its pants on before a big story that could impact the election goes viral before it is verified.
I want to just comment that someone who is friends from all corners of the political spectrum, I hear more and more people on the left and the right and center disparaging the media. And how do they refer to it? The corrupt media. And these are not people on the right necessarily. These are friends of mine on the left and in the middle. It is a lumping together of all of these outlets that they refer to as the media, as both Bernie Sanders and Trump have calling it the corrupt media. And there are many people who I would never expect to speak in these terms, who feel passionately that the media in quotes, is rigged and has an agenda. And it always surprises me because I run into people all the time. Just last night, I was on the call with a few musician friends of mine. We were talking about orchestra things, and suddenly there was this elephant in the room: the evil media. It's I don't know what can be done about it, but it seems the reputation is at a low point.
Well, Daniel, I think there are lots of reasons for that. But certainly one of the things, again, this is an area where Russia is pouring gasoline on the fire. This is a strong narrative that they are pushing. If you will tune into RT, and I pay attention to a particular program, America's Lawyer, which goes after the justice system, but their constant refrain is, not only has the justice system been completely corrupted in the hands of corrupt corporations and political elite, but so is the media. And that's why you don't hear these stories, and you'll only hear them from us. And that is RT and Sputnik, those Russian propaganda. RT stands for Russia Today. Those Russian propaganda outlets are pushing that narrative very hard, that mainstream media, and this is why you're hearing it from your friends on the left, or I shouldn't say this is why. This is also going to your friends on the left, that mainstream media is in the pocket of corrupt corporations. So again, they pick on weaknesses of our own making. They take a kernel of truth or more than a kernel, and they amplify it to their own means.
But I think we might want to add here that there's been a loss of trust in all of our institutions. So the media, unfortunately, is in good company here. And, you know, it's at one point, trust in Congress dropped to something like 9% recently. It's now, I guess, around 25%. But in many of our institutions, there's a complete lack of confidence and trust. And I think that traces directly to, again, this gap in civic education, a lack of understanding, a lack of kind of the preparation to do the critical thinking that's necessary now more than ever, what with the social media platforms. I think they have a much larger responsibility as well than what they have embraced even now. But this is the kind of thing I think that's got to be addressed and has got to be changed. And we're going to have to do it by reinvigorating our education at very basic levels.
Ted, why don't you address sort of part of the groundwork that I was thinking about? It's not just, in my amateur view, it's not just a matter of when do we start teaching civics, how do we approach it, et cetera. How do we make the Federalist Papers seem cool, seem approachable? It's also, how do we prepare the educators themselves? How do we prepare the teachers to have a passion for teaching this subject? It has to come from the teacher. It has to come from the individual in the classroom. How do you convince these people this is worth it?
Great question. I'm going to get to it in just a second. But first, a couple of statistics to underline what my friends Suzanne and Elizabeth have just talked about. In a study done 2 years ago, 35% of millennials reported that they were losing faith in basic democracy. 43% said or agreed with the statement that the Constitution of the United States made sense in the 18th century, but is somewhat irrelevant in the 21st century. In a Democracy Project study of 1,400 adults, when asked about the importance of democracy in American society, only 39% of young adults aged 29 and under said it was absolutely important. And yes, this does tie right back into civic education, largely. The best, most reliable national measure we have on how well our students are attaining, are learning in this area, is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP and Civics tests done every 4 years. In that test, consistently for the past 20 years, students have been able to only display a 23.5% to be more accurate, proficient score in this area so vitally important to the future of our republic. Matter of fact, in the 8th grade NAEP recently done in 2018, when asked to define the Bill of Rights, only 37% of the kids could define the purpose of the Bill of Rights. Hello, there's a big hint right in the title. Now, to your specific question about teachers, the vast majority of frontline social studies, civics teachers have a passion for the subject. They want to do a good job. They believe in the vital importance of it. It's not their fault that students are not attaining well. The fault lies with policymakers who prioritized a few subjects over all others. For example, at the federal level, the federal government, and of course the most important things in education happen at the state and local level. We have a tradition of local control of education very appropriately in this country. But the federal level has a very important role to play in spurring innovation and equity in learning opportunities. It's at the federal level, the federal government spends $54 per enrolled school child in this country on STEM support, and 5 cents, as opposed to that $54 for STEM, 5 cents on civic education. Every state has state standards in the social studies. The problem is the frontline teachers don't have the time and they're not given the resources to teach the amount of material that's in the standards. In 9 states in this country, you don't have to take civics in order to graduate high school. Isn't that pretty sad for the residents in those 9 states? And depending if you want to be generous or not, in this era of assessment-based education, where if it isn't tested, it isn't taught, isn't trite, it's the reality. If you want to be generous, there are only 13 states in this country that have any meaningful assessment in civic learning. And yes, the teacher preparation requirements in a vast majority of the states are woefully inadequate. You have to have a bachelor's degree and pass a pretty simple little test that isn't even as rigorous as the NAEP test that I mentioned that students have to pass. So the answer is, we've got to beef up policies, either through legislatures, governors, state school boards, and increase resources if we want the civic education our republic needs.
Teacher prep. Oh, I'm sorry, Dana.
You go, and then I'll remember what I was going to say. You go.
I was just
If I
going to
could
say,
add something after Suzanne, I'd like to too.
Then you go next, and I'll go after that.
Okay.
that, you know, part of what makes this so hard for teachers and why they really do need to be trained is that teaching civics can be almost as tricky as teaching sex ed and almost as controversial. And it's so sad. I mean, one of the things that I find so distressing is that the polarization that we see in, you know, across this country on virtually every issue is making its way into civic education as well. And it's becoming, you know, in some places and in some contexts, a partisan issue, which is really sad. And that's maybe one reason teachers are also reluctant to sort of go there.
If the gentle lady from California would please yield to the gentleman from Idaho for a moment. You know, vast majority schooling's going on right now through Zoom, through these various platforms. In a certain Midwestern state that I won't be so indiscreet as to name, but it begins with I, teachers doing the normal activity of teaching about this presidential election, doing guided, respectful classroom discussions of controversial issues, have been hauled into their principal's office because parents happened to wander by and saw the lesson, very appropriate, educationally sound lesson that the teacher was providing. And the parent called the teacher and said, I don't want my kids learning about this election. I don't want my kids learning about these issues. And so superintendents, principals are scared. This is such inauthentic behavior and it turns kids off. I yield the balance of my time to the gentle lady from California.
Well, I was going to just point out that one of the things we can thank Ted and his Civics Now coalition for doing is persuading a bipartisan pair of Congress people, Rosa DeLauro and Tom Cole, of introducing the Educating for Democracy Act of 2020. And I would say this is a signal event because it's been a long time coming before we got anybody to stand up and pay the kind of national attention to the problem that's required. Now, Ted would tell you we don't think this act will pass in this busy term, controversial term, but it's there and it's a starting point. And I think, Ted, you deserve to take a bow for this.
Well, very kind, and we'll talk about the act, which will pass in the next Congress in a minute. But let's let our host, Daniel, get a question in here edgewise.
If he dares.
I'm going to dare to make a comment because when Ted was talking about how all of this, in a sense, has to come from the top, from congressional leadership, from mayors, from governors, it reminded me of a conversation I had on this show recently with Adrian Perkins, who's running for the Senate from Louisiana. He's the mayor of Shreveport. He's 34 years old. He went to West Point. He went to Harvard Law. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He won the mayorship at age 32 of his hometown of Shreveport. He's an extremely compelling, dynamic figure. And I asked him about the role of arts and the humanities in society. And he said it has to come from life experience of a given leader. He said, look at me, before 9/11, I had planned to go to LSU to study architecture and art. I was an art lover from a kid. He grew up very poor with a single mother in Shreveport. He said art kept me going as a kid, and I wanted to go to LSU for that. Then 9/11 happened. He decided to go to West Point, pursue other things. But he said, the fact is, I place a huge importance on the humanities and on the power of art and on the power of music, because that's something that in my own life I can look back on with a degree of positivity and sureness and say, wow, this really helped mold and in a way save me, meaning him, Mayor Perkins. So what do you do when there are obtuse, culturally ignorant, devoid of curiosity people elevated to positions of power and influence?
May I take a stab at that and, of course, turn your question on its head? When people like that are elected to office, if you do view that they are have those attributes you just described, Daniel, you vote them out. But you have to be motivated to vote first, and you have to have a civic disposition to become engaged and possess a civic skill to know how to vote, and civic knowledge to know why it's so important to vote. But back to this notion of partisanship and bipartisanship, civic education is a very nonpartisan, bipartisan issue supported by a majority of the American people. A couple of weeks ago, the very respected Republican pollster, Dr. Frank Luntz, included 2 questions for us on a regular survey he does of likely voters, a well-respected survey. When presented with 7 options on how to strengthen our democracy and to have a meaningful impact on strengthening American identity, and these options included ranked choice voting, more participation in religious activities, less money in politics, easier access to voting. The number one thing respondents picked was civic education in our K-12 schools. Matter of fact, it was kind of interesting. Of all of these various solutions, Democrats agreed with the statement about civics, 56%. Republicans agreed with the statement, 56%. Overall total, when you throw in the independents, 57%. Another data point. Phi Delta Kappa annually does a survey of the public's attitude of what's important in public education. Last year, they released their results about a year ago. 92% of respondents said civic education and preparation for citizenship was the most important job of our schools.
So there's obviously some reason to be hopeful in all of this. And I think another hopeful sign, something that I would mention, another report that's just come out, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, talked about the number of people, notwithstanding the dismal statistics on education and civics and the polarization that we've been mentioning, something in the 80% range, both groups said they're hopeful that there can be change. And I think civic education then, done properly, done well, which of course, as you mentioned earlier in a question, Daniel, is going to require professional training for many teachers who haven't been prepared for this, can really make a difference in the divide we're confronting. But I think this divide has major national security implications because, you know, you look at a country, I'll take a really extreme example like Venezuela. What do you think explains that? Well, I would say it's the extraordinary difference in wealth. We're on that same path. So there are many things that really require attention, and attention by our governmental leaders, which then leads us right back to understanding the issues, how to change them, and again, that 4-letter word, vote.
If I may ask Suzanne a question, jumping off of that regarding to security, You touched on this before. It's regarding voting and elections. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission mentioned the need for promoting civics and media literacy as a way to strengthen our elections. Can you tell us how the commission came to that conclusion and give us some insights on what the thinking is with that key recommendation?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which was set up by Congress to make some recommendations on an overarching strategy for strengthening our position in cyberspace and to come up with a strategy for improving our cybersecurity. And of course, we had to address the issues around elections. And so we make some recommendations with regard to strengthening the sort of traditional concepts of cybersecurity, but including providing more resources to state and local election officials, which are desperately needed from the federal coffers, if you will, but also recognizing that cognitive security, as a lot of people refer to it, is also critically important for the integrity of our elections, and combating information operations, as I said, to get Americans to disengage, to not know where the truth is, and certainly efforts that are designed to undermine a particular candidate in favor of another. Those are things that we need to work to counter. And one of the ways that we do that is by improving media literacy, creating the kind of skepticism that we talked about with this, we see reflected in the treatment of this most recent New York Post story, but also building that public resilience. And I like the hopeful tone that the conversation is taking here. And I think, the other sign of hope, despite the dismal statistics and everything that Elizabeth and Ted have talked about, I think the fact that the vast majority of Americans, for example, are wearing masks is an indication of civic responsibility. They may not think of it exactly in those terms, but it is an indication that, Americans, for the most part, want to do what's right, not just for themselves, but their family, their community, and the country. And so a big part of this civic education, it's not about boosterism for our country and to say that we do everything great and we're perfect and aren't we wonderful. Quite different. It is to say democracy is wonderful because it can change, because individuals have an important role to play, can make a difference, just like wearing a mask can make a difference. That you can, if you are unhappy with the racial injustice, march in the streets, you can make a difference. That's a wonderful aspect of our democracy, right? And learn how to be effective agents of change. So I do think that there are important signs of hope, but I think as we come out of this divisive election, and as we begin to emerge from the isolation of the pandemic, we do need a new focus on civic renewal. We need to really pay attention to rebuilding our sense of community, rediscovering our shared fundamental values, and our sense of civic responsibility. So I hope that we will see this effort to bring the country back together, to renew a sense of community and renew civic education.
Suzanne is really so right. We talk about how to fix the problems we all see. Civic education is not going to be a panacea. We won't wave a wand and have it all change overnight. It's going to take some rebuilding. But if we can start and begin to take this seriously, I think we can lay a new foundation. I mentioned the American Academy. They talk about just that kind of rebuilding process. But it's also interesting to me that the Solarium Commission that you asked Suzanne about came to the idea that civic education might be important. It's curious that there have been several commissions recently designed for other purposes that at the end of the day have said, wait a minute, we get it. Civic education has got to be the foundational first stop, if you will. And the one I'm thinking about right now is the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. I don't think they thought civic education was going to be front and center to their work. And yet their final report, and Ted probably can say more about it, includes that in large letters. So we've got an effort that there's an opportunity in this crisis if we want to build forward. And I think civic education is that really important building block.
And Daniel, I would just say on your point that you've made repeatedly about the importance of the arts and humanities, but particularly the arts. I know for you it's music, and I love music as well, but I really love live theater. And I think, when getting back to live performances, because again, that is a shared experience. I mean, we can have the shared experience virtually as well, but won't it be great when we can get back into a shared space, sitting next to each other? You don't know whether the person next to you is a Democrat or Republican, lives in a rural or urban environment, doesn't matter. You're enjoying this experience together, and it's just one more reminder of our shared values. So I think, again, the arts can be an important promoter of civic engagement and civic sense.
And it can also be a learning experience, as we're all seeing from Hamilton.
Let me interject briefly. Here's what I wonder about. It seems to me to care about civics, you have to care about this country. You have to respect something fundamental and have certain amount of love for this country for there to be a reason that you would care about civics in the first place. And it seems that there is a lot of beating down of, trying to phrase it, of the flaws, a lot of emphasis of the deep flaws of this country, so much to the point that it seems difficult to make the argument at the same time, because many educational institutions are placing such an enormous emphasis in response to happenings of the spring, summer, and fall 2020, an enormous emphasis on the flaws and the original sin, or take it out of quotes, original sin of this country, that it seems difficult to also impart the message that at the same time, this is a wonderful place that you have to respect and learn about and care about. Do those go together?
Absolutely. Isn't protest, isn't pointing out that we haven't reached that more perfect union yet, in and of itself, an act of patriotism and love of country. It's just got to be matched with civic knowledge, civic skills, and a disposition to be effectively civically engaged, to understand that the way that many, many groups, women, people of color, our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, have been able to overcome being put down, being denied their rights, is through the very mechanisms that the founders created. Our rule of law, our independent judiciary, our very Constitution itself, and the Bill of Rights, under which progress can be made.
I would definitely agree with Ted, but I'd add maybe a personal perspective. I said I started my career with a decade of civil rights litigation in the Deep South, and I really thought I understood that problem, but I have learned so much in the last year that I did not know. For me, beginning by reading the biography of Frederick Douglass, but then going on to begin to listen more carefully to what the concerns were coming out of Black Lives Matter. I would say that to make this kind of a simple construct, one of the things that our democracy rests on is an ability to put the body politic ahead of your own personal interests, not always to put yourself first. It's a sense of civic duty, civic obligation, empathy, if you will. And to empathize requires knowledge and understanding. And so I think that what we've been going through pretty remarkably is a relook, a re-understanding that ought to be a way to increase that level of empathy, responsibility for each of us. The fact is, I used to say this to my law students, and I think rather thoughtlessly, if it doesn't work for all of us, it doesn't work for any of us. And I really believed that then, I believe it now, but now I understand how, in fact, it hasn't always worked for all of us. And we need to understand that and work through those kinds of issues. It requires knowledge and understanding as a starting proposition.
It's a really important point that Elizabeth is making, that sometimes it's thought that there are certain, underserved communities in this country who need civic education. And of course, what Elizabeth is pointing out is that all of us need civic education. All of us need to better understand the ways in which we need to be empathetic and the ways in which we need to be more effective agents to bring about the change that moves us towards a more perfect union. That we all need to think of ourselves as founding fathers and mothers of this nation, because this nation continues to be found, continues to get lost, if you will, and continues to need to be found. And all of us have a role to play in that.
Ted, do you want to talk about how successful you are right now in this election season? I guess this election season has been going on for a year and a half or something. But if you would talk about how much are you getting through? You can talk about the act that you mentioned before that'll come before Congress, but also how much are you getting through on a more granular level at the middle school down the road from where I am in New Hampshire, or at the place down the road from you in the Midwest?
Daniel, thank you. I'm going to answer, but not in the context of this presidential election or any election. I'm a recovering politician. I've reached the 12th step. More important is what Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said all across this country, and she is a great hero of civic education who spent years beating this drum, we need to do better. She said, knowledge of our system of government, our rights and responsibilities as citizens is not passed down through the gene pool. It must be taught. Here's where we're seeing success in our crusade, and Suzanne and Elizabeth are both great crusaders for more effective civic learning. We are seeing increasingly policymakers paying attention and saying, what can we do? For example, in Indiana, the legislature created a task force. The lieutenant governor of Indiana chaired this task force. It started its work right as the pandemic hit, so they've done most of their work over Zoom, but they will be releasing a report very soon with very meaningful recommendations on how to strengthen and improve civic learning for all Indiana students. And similar things are happening across the country. You know, I talked about the lack of opportunity, which is strictly a time and resources function in the vast majority of schools in this country. This has happened at the same time that there has been a revolution of innovation on how to teach civics and American history that truly make the subject engaging and come alive for the students. And we're seeing these programs like the iCivics program, an online gaming platform created by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, or at least she was the inspiration for it, which is now being used in something like 70% of the middle and high schools in the country, where students can role play being a citizen, role play being an office holder, and truly get an appreciation. Programs like the Bill of Rights Institute, which allows students to explore just what went into the creation of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. A revolution of innovation through these programs. We're seeing from the federal level, yes, H.R. 8295, bipartisan bill introduced by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, good Democrat of Connecticut, and Congressman Tom Cole, a very good Republican from Oklahoma, that would reverse this decades-long trend of the federal government ignoring civic education and provide substantial federal level investment in innovation, ensuring equity, which are both longtime roles of the federal government in education policy, and ensuring that we do, as Suzanne properly brought up, we do properly prepare teachers to be frontline civics and history teachers. It's another project going on called the Educating for American Democracy Project, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the U.S. Department of Education, that offers a promise of revolutionizing how we teach civics and American history together. Those two subjects, it's like the old Johnny Mercer song, love and marriage, go together like a horse and carriage. Well, so that's the only time I'm going to sing, Suzanne, I promise. Other than, I'm just a bill, yes, I'm just a bill, sitting here on Capitol Hill, doesn't cut it anymore. We need more innovation, like this EAD project I just mentioned, which will help students understand American history and civics where they live. Daniel, I hope that was responsive to your question, and I promise not to sing anymore.
It was responsive. I was thinking, is civic education something that plays a major role in other countries? What do other countries do in an equivalent scenario in which they go out to teach something like civics or social studies? Is there anything to be learned, or are we at the forefront?
I think there is. Suzanne, you may want to take this, but let me just lead off by saying we asked ourselves that question. And stepping back just a bit, the way we, meaning Suzanne and I and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, first came upon some of these issues was watching what Russia was doing in Eastern Europe and how they were manipulating systems and so on. And that gave us the kind of very serious concern that what we were seeing in Eastern Europe could be happening in Western Europe and finally here. And Suzanne has done a wonderful job of articulating all of that. But then we said, well, you know, who is addressing this? And when you look outside the United States, the first example that comes up in my mind is Finland, where after all, they have been right there next to the bear for their entire career, as it were. And they have figured out that civic education is the way to confront some of the disinformation challenges that they have been facing for many, many years from their Russian neighbor. Suzanne, you may want to pick it up at this point, because I know you've spent time looking at what's happening in some of the Eastern European countries that are looking at this problem too.
Well, it's always valuable to look at what other countries are doing. Elizabeth is right about Finland, Sweden. Those are relatively small and homogeneous populations. And so there's only so much that we can imitate from what they're doing, but interesting lessons nonetheless. Eastern Europe has been challenged, and Eastern Europe is a reminder of how important it is to have leadership at the top that supports what you're doing. So countries like Georgia and Estonia and Hungary that got off to an early start in particularly around attacks from Russia, information attacks. In countries like Hungary, where there's been a backsliding of the democracy, and we've seen the attacks on the judiciary there, et cetera. The efforts around countering disinformation have similarly floundered. So it is a real challenge. Daniel, you made this point earlier in our conversation that, if you don't have leaders who really get it, that it becomes so much more difficult. We have the advantage, really, of having a federalist system. And while it's frustrating and it makes the work of somebody like Ted McConnell that much harder, because you've got, the 50 states and the territories that you've got to go each one. But it does give us an opportunity. It gives us another place to go if the federal government is really dropping the ball and not the place to look to for leadership in these areas. And as our dear friend Danielle Allen, who you should really have on your show sometime, Daniel,
yes.
would talks very eloquently about some of the lessons we need to be reminded about in terms of the strength of our federalist system and the ability for innovation within the states, et cetera. The other point I'd like to make, Daniel, is with respect to your friends who are, and your point about how people get so down on this country, so aware of the many, many flaws within our country. I think a big part of the low survey results on democracy and support for democracy, particularly among young people, is that it has become synonymous with unbridled capitalism. And Elizabeth mentioned the economic disparity as being a really important issue here. And I think that's, again, part of what we need to do is we need to, help people understand that the economic disparity and the flaws of capitalism are not inherent characteristics of a strong democracy. And that, again, in fact, that our democracy gives us the tools and the opportunity to bring about a better nation, to make changes, to reduce economic disparity.
And
that it's not inevitable.
Suzanne is right where I wanted to take the conversation, so she's given me a little bit of an introduction, if I could. I think one of the lessons we learned from what happened in the emerging democracies in Eastern Europe is that they equated simply voting without the underpinnings necessary in a civil society to democracy. And of course, what happened was they unwittingly voted in a kleptocracy in many cases. And you say, well, that couldn't happen here. But then you look at the statistics and you say there's reason to worry. Again, I refer to the American Academy report from this spring, but from 1993 to 2017, the average real family income, they report to us, of the bottom 99% of the US population grew 15.5%. while the incomes of the top 1% of American families grew by 95.5%. And I think that is, once again, powerful evidence that we've got to begin to think about this democracy as something we all have a stake in. We cannot look at it as an opportunity to grab what's best for us. And if I might, I would end with just a little story of my father-in-law, now deceased, who was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and a Republican from his birth. As you might gather, I might not always have been. He once said, when I was the CEO, the difference between what I made and the man on the floor was not what it is now. He said, now it's 400% difference. He said, that's wrong. We can't live that way. So I think, that story is almost worth telling for another reason, and that is that this is a bipartisan issue. It's not one that talks about, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? This country has been wonderful to all of us in the past. It should be wonderful to many of us. It should be wonderful to all of us going forward. And this is a divide that we've got to address, I think.
A big amen to what Elizabeth just said. And Daniel, if I can just interject very quickly, where my eyes got opened up, that civic education was a national security imperative, is a couple years ago, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, who at that time was the minority ranking member on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, commissioned a report that showed, and this is in response to the allegations of Russian interference, more than allegations, in 2016, that showed the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, who had been dealing, as Suzanne pointed out, or Elizabeth did, about Finland being next to the bear, they're practically in the bear's paw, and pointed out how those countries have built societal resilience against interference attempts through civic education and media literacy. It is a national security imperative.
It does seem to me that a lot of the doubts many people have when they look at the whole system stem from the Citizens United decision, when suddenly infinite amounts of money from who knows where could be put into the political system. It goes back to what Suzanne was talking about before, which was basically the limits or lack of limits of capitalism and you look at the billions of dollars, I remember well the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer. This is all very related, and it seems until, if it ever happens, that there's an end to that there will be this unbridled torrent of money from somewhere into the political system that is deeply upsetting to many Americans.
I found it interesting that in the current confirmation hearing for Judge Barrett, I believe it was yesterday, might have been this morning, Senator Lindsey Graham, chairman of the committee, said for the first time, and of course he was a big supporter of Citizens United and of Senator Mitch McConnell's efforts to ensure money is free speech. Lindsey Graham said for the first time he really wanted to look into this whole issue of where the money's coming from and limiting the money. Now, this may be because his Democratic opponent, Mr. Harrison, has raised something on the order of near $80 million, while Senator Graham has raised roughly $50 million, both amounts of which are obscene.
With the election underway, Suzanne, and then I'll ask all of you to weigh in because I know we don't have unlimited time. What message do you have for the people listening and watching this? Because I think one big obvious takeaway is respect the system and vote and participate. But beyond that, beyond the obvious, what do you hope people take away from this conversation in terms of awakened curiosities regarding the country that we live in?
Yeah, it's such an important question, Daniel. I have been so heartened, at least by what we're seeing so far. I mean, of course, the election is underway. There's no more waiting for election day. People are voting as we speak, and they are voting in huge numbers. And you can certainly see, as you've pointed out, there's a lot to be discouraged about. There's a lot to question. How could our democracy have gotten to this, to this stage? And can my vote make a difference? And we are barraged with messages from all angles every day that the system is rigged, that your vote won't count, that it doesn't make any difference. And the American people seem to be rejecting those messages and turning out in huge numbers. And I think it is the basis upon which we have such hope and that we want to build with this push for empowering individuals through civic education, because they deserve to be empowered, because they are not giving up. They are persisting. And I think that is just incredibly inspiring. And I want to encourage everyone to continue to do that. This, we heard from 4 current, this administration, national security officials, director of the FBI, director of NSA and Cybercom, the head of cybersecurity and infrastructure security for DHS, and our top counterintelligence official, all of whom said they are working day and night to protect the security and integrity of our elections, and they have confidence that the votes will be counted as cast. Director Wray has said there's no widespread evidence of ballot fraud. So I think it's really important for Americans to have confidence. My successor at DHS said, my confidence in the security of your vote has never been higher. I think Americans need to go and vote with confidence, and then they need to continue the work, regardless of how the election comes out. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Elizabeth?
Well, I think that, again, I guess I would refer to the American Academy report. There are some issues that may indeed be so large that we can't make an immediate change. Citizens United might be an example. But there are many things that we could begin to look at on a step-by-step basis. And I would say one experience I had, again, as Dean of a law school, was to offer, at their request, space for the redistricting commission of citizens that California empowered some years ago. It was an amazing experience. It happened during the summer. We gave them one of our largest classrooms, and I watched them redraw these districts. It was an amazing thing. The Academy report suggests that there be either state or national legislation that supports and empowers this kind of thing in every state. I think that would be a major step towards making sure that our elected officials actually represent us in a fair way. Right now, we confront a situation where something like 18 states, I may get my numbers a little off here, are really running the Senate. Very small in terms of population. Well, we want to always protect minority rights, but we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where vast parts of the population are disenfranchised, where their votes are reduced. And so I think informing ourselves about these issues, some of them are, as I say, large, big constitutional change is a huge project, not something we expect overnight. But there are others that can happen with much less time and energy. The very fact that something like 15% or less ever attend a local town meeting or anything that may deal with their immediate interaction, I mean, these are, again, steps people can take. And I think simply informing ourselves, making sure that we take advantage of the news media that we still have that are open-minded, fair, and balanced, and that we not be persuaded that everything is rigged. Everything is not rigged, but we have to be mindful and thoughtful about the differences and the sources on which information is based and relies.
Ted, if you will answer whatever you were going to say, but put a finer point on the responsibility of universities, because we've talked about K-12. Do universities and college have a responsibility in this too? What should they be doing? What do you tell a college junior who walks into a civics class? How do you address it?
The college junior who walks into a civics class on a college campus, where are you? You're not on a college campus. They don't exist anymore in the vast majority of institutions. What I say to higher education, you've got to do remedial civic education for a time because the kids aren't getting it K-12. You're training kids to be cellists, or you're training kids to be scientists. You're training kids for a variety of jobs. The one thing they're all going to have in common is they're going to be citizens of this great republic who need to have civic knowledge, civic skills, and a disposition to participate. The other thing I say to higher education is don't wait for the policymakers to tell you you've got to beef up teacher pre-service education in this area. Take the bull by the horns, model what Dean Diana Hess at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has done, and increase opportunities to learn for pre-service teachers in civics and American history. And finally, to voters, I say this: vote in honor of your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, whoever was alive 1919, 1920 in that chain, because they didn't have the opportunity to vote in a vast majority of states in this country, and they didn't have the opportunity to vote for President of the United States until 100 years ago next month. Vote in honor of them and in honor of all those brave women, joined by some brave men, who used the Constitution, who used the Bill of Rights, who were civically informed and engaged and brought about the 19th Amendment that allowed women to vote.
On that very optimistic note, unless anybody has anything they'd like to say as a last word, I would like to thank deeply Elizabeth Rindskopf Parker, Suzanne Spaulding, and Ted McConnell. It's been illuminating. I think listeners and viewers will find it illuminating and thought-provoking. I certainly have. And it's an ongoing conversation. I hope we can continue sometime because it's meaningful. And
But Daniel, I want to thank you because the media is not giving this issue enough attention, and you've given us ample time to express the concerns we have here. So really, thanks go in your direction.
And thank you for the beautiful music you provide people all over this world, and I know it inspires them.
Good to be with you again, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Great to see you, and great to see all of you. Thank you.